Welcome. Tonight, we embark on a journey through time, a journey that spans more than 600 years, from the hills of Anatolia to the gates of Vienna, from a small principality led by a tribal chief to one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire. It is a long story, a complex story, but we will tell it slowly, carefully, without rushing, without dramatic flourishes, just the steady progression of events. The rise and fall of dynasties, the turning of centuries. This is not a story of constant warfare, though wars will feature. It is not a story of intrigue and betrayal alone, though there will be intrigue. It is, more than anything, a story of persistence, of an empire that lasted longer than most, that adapted when it needed to, that held together territories and peoples who had little in common except their ruler. The Ottoman Empire began around the year 1299, give or take a few years. The exact date is uncertain. The early years are shrouded in legend and incomplete records. But somewhere around the turn of the 14th century, a man named Osman established what would become a dynasty. The empire ended in 1922, 623 years. Think of that span of time. The empire was founded when medieval Europe was still building Gothic cathedrals. It ended in the age of automobiles and airplanes. It witnessed the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. During those 6 centuries, the Ottomans ruled lands that today comprise more than 40 modern nations. At its height, the empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the shores of Algeria to the mountains of the Caucasus. It controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. It held Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire renamed Istanbul. The empire was Muslim, but it was not exclusively so. Christians and Jews lived within its borders, governed by their own religious laws in matters of personal status. Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Kurds, Bulgarians, Serbs, Albanians, and dozens of other ethnicities coexisted under Ottoman rule. It was, in many ways, a remarkable achievement. Not a perfect empire. No empire is perfect. There was oppression, there was exploitation, there were massacres and forced conversions, but there was also tolerance, at least by the standards of the time. There was cultural achievement, scientific advancement, architectural magnificence. Tonight, we will trace this empire from beginning to end. We will meet its sultans, though not all of them. There were 36 in total. We will witness its expansion and its contraction. We will see it at its zenith under Suleiman the Magnificent. We will watch it struggle through centuries of decline. We will observe its final collapse in the aftermath of World War I. This is history on a grand scale, but we will approach it with patience. We will not rush. There is no need to rush. History has already happened. It is complete. We are simply walking through it, observing, understanding. Let us begin at the beginning. In the hills of northwestern Anatolia, in the late 13th century, where a tribe of Turkish nomads is about to change the course of history. Origins and Osman 1299-1326. The story begins with migration. Long before there was an Ottoman Empire, there were Turkic peoples moving westward from Central Asia. This migration took place over centuries, pushed by other migrations, by climate changes, by the search for better pastures. These Turkic peoples were originally nomadic. They lived in tents. They herded sheep and horses. They were skilled horsemen and archers. They were organized into tribes, each led by a chief or khan. In the 11th century, one group of Turks, the Seljuks, established a large empire that included much of Anatolia, the peninsula we now call Turkey. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, as it was called, became a significant power, but empires rise and fall. By the mid-13th century, the Seljuk Sultanate was weakening. The Mongol invasions from the east had devastated much of the region. The Seljuk survived, but their power was diminished. Their territory fragmented into smaller principalities, called beyliks. One of these beyliks was led by a man named Ertugrul. He was a tribal chief, a leader of perhaps a few hundred families. His territory was in northwestern Anatolia, near the border with the Byzantine Empire. Ertugrul's beylik was small and unremarkable, but he had a son named Osman. Osman was born around 1258. We know very little about his early life with certainty. The sources are sparse and often contradictory. Later Ottoman historians embellished his story with legends and prophecies. But beneath the legends, there was a real man. Osman inherited leadership of the beylik around 1299, when his father died. He was approximately 40 years old, middle-aged by medieval standards, experienced, respected by his followers. The beylik Osman inherited was positioned strategically. It lay on the frontier between the Muslim and Christian worlds. To the west was the Byzantine Empire, ancient and declining, but still wealthy and culturally sophisticated. The frontier was a place of opportunity. Byzantine defenses were weak. Local populations were sometimes willing to accommodate new rulers if they provided security. There was land to be taken, towns to conquer, plunder to be gained. Osman was not a great visionary planning an empire. At least, we have no evidence that he was. He was a practical man responding to practical opportunities. He raided Byzantine territories. He conquered small towns. He attracted followers other Turks, but also Greeks, adventurers, anyone willing to join a successful leader. One of his first significant conquests was the town of Eskişehir, then Karacahisar. These were not large cities. They were fortified towns. But each conquest increased Osman's prestige and resources. The Byzantine Empire, distracted by internal conflicts and other threats, could not mount an effective response. Local Byzantine nobles sometimes allied with Osman rather than fight him. The old certainties were breaking down. Osman's approach was pragmatic. He offered terms to towns that surrendered. He allowed Christians to keep their properties and practice their religion if they accepted his rule. This was not unusual for the time. Tolerance was often good policy. It reduced resistance. It preserved the tax base. Gradually, Osman's beylik grew. Other Turkish leaders, seeing his success, acknowledged his leadership. Followers flocked to him. The beylik was becoming more than just a tribe. It was becoming a nascent state. Osman never used the title sultan. He called himself bey, a more modest title meaning chief or lord. But his followers began to be called Osmanlis, followers of Osman. In European languages, this became Ottomans, the Ottomans, the name that would echo through centuries of history. But in Osman's time, they were still a small group, barely noticeable on the grand stage of world events. Osman continued his expansion until old age and illness slowed him. By the early 1320s, he was in his 60s, perhaps older. He had gout, which made writing difficult. He delegated more authority to his son, Orhan. One target remained tantalizingly close: the city of Bursa, a substantial city, wealthy, well-fortified. Osman besieged Bursa in 1326, but he did not live to see its fall. He died that year, probably in his late 60s. According to tradition, Bursa fell just as Osman was dying. His followers brought him the news. He smiled, they said, and then passed away. This is probably legend, but it is a fitting legend. The small beylik he had built was about to take a major step forward. Osman was buried in Bursa, in a tomb that would become a place of pilgrimage for later Ottomans. He had founded a dynasty. His descendants would rule for 6 more centuries. But he could not have known this. He was simply a successful frontier chief who had done well for his people. The foundations were laid. Now, his son Orhan would build upon them. Expansion in Anatolia and Europe, 1326-1389. Orhan became the leader of the Ottomans in 1326. He was a different leader from his father. Osman had been a warrior chief. Orhan was more of a statesman. He understood that conquest alone was not enough. The conquered territories needed to be organized, governed, integrated. Bursa became Orhan's capital. It was a real city, not just a collection of tents. This was significant. The Ottomans were transitioning from nomadic warriors to settled rulers. Orhan continued expanding in Anatolia. He conquered Nicaea in 1331. This was a historically important city, the site of famous church councils in early Christianity. Now, it became an Ottoman city, renamed Zik. Orhan also conquered Nicomedia, renamed Zmit. With these conquests, the Ottomans controlled much of northwestern Anatolia. They were no longer a minor beylik. They were a significant regional power. But Orhan's most consequential move was crossing into Europe. The Byzantine Empire, by the 14th century, was a shadow of its former glory. It had been devastated by the Fourth Crusade in 1204. When Western Crusaders sacked Constantinople, the empire had recovered Constantinople in 1261, but it never regained its strength. By Orhan's time, the Byzantine Empire was racked by civil war. Two claimants, John V and John VI, were fighting for the throne. Both sought allies wherever they could find them. In 1352 or 1353, the Ottomans crossed the Dardanelles into Europe for the first time. They were invited. John VI, one of the Byzantine claimants, asked for Ottoman military help. Orhan sent troops, led by his son Suleiman Pasha. The Ottomans helped John VI. But once in Europe, they saw opportunities. The Balkans were divided. Bulgaria, Serbia, and various other principalities were often at war with each other and with Byzantium. Defenses were weak. The Ottomans began taking fortresses. In 1354, a massive earthquake struck the region. Walls collapsed. Towns were devastated. The Ottomans took advantage of the chaos. Suleiman Pasha captured the fortress of Gallipoli. This gave the Ottomans a permanent foothold in Europe. Orhan continued to rule until 1362. By then, he was elderly. His son, Suleiman, who had led the expansion into Europe, had died in a hunting accident. This was a blow. Suleiman had been capable and popular. Leadership passed to another son, Murad. Murad I, as he would be known, would take the Ottoman state to new heights. Murad I ruled from 1362 to 1389. His reign was marked by aggressive expansion, particularly in the Balkans. Murad moved the Ottoman capital from Bursa to Edirne, a city in Thrace, in Europe. This was symbolic. The Ottomans were no longer primarily an Anatolian power. They were a European power too. Murad conquered much of Thrace and Macedonia. He took Plovdiv. He took Sofia. He pushed into Serbia and Bulgaria. The Balkan Christian states, unable to unite against the common threat, fell one by one. Murad was not just a conqueror. He was an organizer. He established administrative systems. He created the Timar system, a form of military land grant that would sustain Ottoman armies for centuries. Soldiers were granted the right to collect taxes from specific lands in exchange for military service. This created a loyal, self-sustaining military. Murad also established the devshirme system, though it may have been formalized later. This was the practice of recruiting Christian boys, converting them to Islam, and training them for military or administrative service. It was controversial, obviously. Families had their sons taken, but the boys who succeeded in this system could rise to the highest positions in the empire. The most famous product of the devshirme was the janissaries. These were elite infantry troops, trained from youth, loyal to the Sultan. They would become the backbone of Ottoman military might. In 1389, Murad faced a coalition of Serbian and Bosnian forces at Kosovo. The Battle of Kosovo, as it became known, was hard fought. The outcome was not entirely clear. Both sides claimed victory, but during the battle, Murad was assassinated. A Serbian knight, pretending to defect, got close to the Sultan and stabbed him. Murad died on the battlefield. His son Bayezid was with the army. He immediately took command. According to some sources, he had his brother Yaqub executed to prevent a succession dispute. This was brutal, but it was effective. There was no civil war. Bayezid was accepted as the new sultan. The Battle of Kosovo was inconclusive militarily, but strategically, it was an Ottoman victory. Serbia became an Ottoman vassal. The expansion continued. In less than a century, the Ottomans had grown from a small beylik to a major power controlling territories in both Anatolia and Europe. The foundations of an empire were now firmly in place. But the empire faced its first major crisis under Bayezid, a crisis that would test whether the Ottoman state would survive at all. Crisis and Recovery 1389-1451. Bayezid I, who ruled from 1389 to 1402, was nicknamed Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. The name reflected his rapid military campaigns. He was aggressive, ambitious, perhaps overconfident. Bayezid continued expanding in the Balkans. He besieged Constantinople in 1394. The Byzantine capital, reduced to a small enclave surrounded by Ottoman territory, seemed on the verge of falling. But Bayezid was also expanding in Anatolia, conquering other Turkish beyliks. This made him enemies. Other Turkish leaders resented Ottoman dominance. And then, from the east, came a new threat. Timur, also called Tamerlane, was a Central Asian conqueror in the tradition of Genghis Khan. He had built a vast empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean. He was elderly by this time, in his 60s, but still formidable. Timur and Bayezid clashed over Anatolia. Both claimed authority over the same territories. Both were proud men unwilling to back down. In 1402, their armies met at the Battle of Ankara. Bayezid's army was large, but many of his troops were recently conquered Anatolian Turks whose loyalty was questionable. When the battle began, some of these troops defected to Timur. The battle was a disaster for the Ottomans. Bayezid's army was destroyed. Bayezid himself was captured. He was taken prisoner by Timur and died in captivity the following year. The circumstances of his death are unclear. Some sources say he was treated well. Others say he was humiliated, possibly kept in a cage. The truth is lost to history. With Bayezid dead and his army destroyed, the Ottoman state seemed finished. Timur restored the Anatolian beyliks that Bayezid had conquered. Ottoman territory shrank dramatically. Bayezid's sons fought among themselves for what remained. This period, from 1402 to 1413, is called the Ottoman Interregnum. Four of Bayezid's sons Suleiman, Musa, and Mehmed competed for power. Alliances shifted. Brothers fought brothers. It was chaos. Eventually, Mehmed emerged victorious. Mehmed I reunited the Ottoman territories and began the process of recovery. His reign, from 1413 to 1421, was focused on consolidation rather than expansion. He suppressed revolts. He stabilized the administration. He carefully avoided antagonizing powerful neighbors. Mehmed I's son, Murad II, continued this careful policy initially, but Murad was also ambitious. He resumed expansion, particularly in the Balkans. Murad laid siege to Constantinople again in 1422, but unsuccessfully. The city's walls were still too strong. He turned his attention to other targets. He conquered Thessaloniki from the Venetians in 1430. He campaigned against Hungary and Poland. But Murad also faced challenges. In 1444, a crusader army led by the Hungarian regent János Hunyadi invaded Ottoman territory. Murad, who had actually abdicated in favor of his young son Mehmed, was recalled to deal with the threat. The two armies met at the Battle of Varna. The Crusaders were decisively defeated. King Władysław III of Poland and Hungary died in the battle. The crusade collapsed. Murad attempted to retire again, but events kept pulling him back. He was a reluctant ruler in some ways, more interested in contemplation and poetry than in warfare. But he was also effective when needed. Murad died in 1451. His son Mehmed, just 19 years old, became sultan for the second time. Mehmed had briefly ruled during his father's retirement attempts, but he had been young and inexperienced then. Now, he was ready. Mehmed too would become the most famous sultan of his era. He would accomplish what his predecessors had attempted but failed to achieve. He would take Constantinople. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic sieges. The Conquest of Constantinople 1451-1453. Constantinople, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years. The city that had survived siege after siege. The walls that had never been breached by a foreign enemy. The last remnant of the Roman Empire. By 1453, Constantinople was a shadow of its former glory. The Byzantine Empire had been reduced to the city itself and a few scattered territories. The population had declined from perhaps 500,000 at its height to maybe 50,000. Large areas within the walls were abandoned, returned to farmland. But the city was still wealthy, still important. It controlled the Bosphorus, the strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled Constantinople controlled trade between east and west, north and south. And the walls. The legendary walls of Constantinople. Triple layers of fortifications. An inner wall 40 feet high. A moat. Towers bristling with defenders. These walls had turned back attackers for a millennium. Mehmed II was determined to take the city. He was young, energetic, ambitious. He had studied history and knew that capturing Constantinople would secure his legacy. He began preparations in 1452. He built a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus called Rumeli Hisar. This allowed him to control shipping through the strait. Ships that refused to pay tolls were sunk. Constantinople was cut off from resupply by sea. Mehmed assembled a massive army. Sources vary on the numbers. Perhaps 80,000 troops, though medieval numbers are always uncertain. He also assembled a fleet of hundreds of ships. Most importantly, Mehmed commissioned enormous cannons. These were among the largest cannons ever built at that time. One, cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, was 27 feet long and could fire a 600-pound stone ball. These cannons could, Mehmed believed, break the ancient walls. The siege began on April 6, 1453. The Ottoman army surrounded the city on the land side. The fleet blockaded it by sea. Inside, the defenders numbered perhaps 7,000, including Genoese and Venetian volunteers who had stayed to help. Emperor Constantine Shi, the last Byzantine emperor, led the defense. He was in his 40s, unmarried, dedicated to his city. He knew the odds were against him. He had requested help from Western Europe, but little came. The West was divided, and many Catholics had no love for the Orthodox Byzantines. The Ottomans bombarded the walls day and night. The massive cannons roared. Stone balls crashed into the ancient walls. Sections crumbled, but the defenders worked frantically at night to repair the breaches. They built inner barricades. They held. Mehmed tried assault after assault. Janissaries charged the walls. Ladders raised, but the defenders threw them back. The Ottomans tried mining under the walls. The defenders countermined and fought underground battles in the tunnels. Mehmed attempted to break the sea defenses. A massive chain stretched across the Golden Horn, the inlet on the city's northern side, preventing the Ottoman fleet from entering. Mehmed ordered his ships dragged overland on greased logs, around the Genoese settlement of Galata, and launched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. It was an impressive feat. Suddenly, the defenders had to defend another section of wall. The siege went on for weeks. Inside the city, morale was sinking. Supplies were running low. There was no sign of relief. Omens were reported. A partial eclipse, an icon that slipped from its platform during a procession. On May 28, Mehmed ordered a final, all-out assault for the next day. He told his troops that they would have 3 days to plunder the city if they took it. This was strong motivation. The assault began before dawn on May 29. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops attacked. First, the irregular forces, expendable troops meant to tire the defenders. Then the Anatolian regulars. Finally, the Janissaries. The defenders were exhausted. They had been fighting for nearly 2 months with little sleep, but they held. Then, disaster. A small gate, the Kirkaporta, was found unlocked. Whether this was an accident or sabotage is unknown. Ottoman soldiers poured through. They got inside the walls. At nearly the same time, a section of wall near the St. Romanus Gate was finally breached. The defenders there, led by the Genoese commander Giustiniani, had fought heroically, but Giustiniani was wounded. He was carried away to seek medical help. His troops, seeing their commander leave, panicked and fled. The Ottomans flooded through the breach. The defenses collapsed. The battle became a slaughter. Emperor Constantine Shi, seeing that all was lost, reportedly tore off his imperial regalia and charged into the melee. He was never seen again. His body was never definitively identified. The last Roman emperor died as a common soldier defending his city. The Ottomans sacked Constantinople for 3 days, as Mehmed had promised. There was killing, looting, churches were desecrated, many inhabitants were enslaved. It was brutal, as sacks of cities always were. But after 3 days, Mehmed ordered the sacking to stop. He entered the city and went to the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral. He proclaimed it a mosque. He prayed there. He declared Constantinople the new capital of his empire. The city would be renamed Istanbul, though the name Constantinople continued to be used for centuries by many. The conquest of Constantinople echoed around the world. Christian Europe was shocked. The ancient bulwark had fallen. The Turks now held one of Christianity's greatest cities. But in the Islamic world, Mehmed was celebrated. He had accomplished what caliphs and sultans had attempted for 800 years. He took the title Fatih, the Conqueror. Mehmed the Conqueror. At age 21, he had secured his place in history. The conquest marked a turning point. The Byzantine Empire was finished. The Ottomans were now unquestionably a major power. The medieval world was ending. A new era was beginning. Expansion and consolidation. 1453-1520. After the conquest of Constantinople, Mehmed the Conqueror did not rest. He spent the next 30 years expanding the empire in all directions. In the Balkans, he conquered Serbia completely, ending its autonomous status. He campaigned against Wallachia and Moldavia, the lands that would later become Romania. He fought with Hungary, though he never managed to conquer it. Mehmed invaded Bosnia in 1463. The Bosnian kingdom was conquered and its last king captured. Bosnia became an Ottoman province. Mehmed also campaigned against Venice, the great maritime republic. Venice had colonies throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Mehmed wanted them. The war lasted from 1463 to 1479. It was exhausting and expensive for both sides. The Ottomans won some victories, conquering several Venetian-held islands and ports. But Venice's navy was formidable. The war ended in a negotiated peace with gains for the Ottomans, but no decisive victory. In Anatolia, Mehmed conquered the remaining Turkish beyliks. The most significant was the Karamanid beylik, finally annexed in 1487, though Mehmed began the process. Mehmed also attempted to expand into Italy. In 1480, Ottoman forces seized the city of Otranto in southern Italy. The plan was to use it as a base for further expansion. Christian Europe was alarmed. The Turks had landed in Italy, but Mehmed died in 1481, at age 49. His death was sudden, possibly from illness, possibly from poison. The cause remains debated. With his death, the Italian campaign was abandoned. The garrison in Otranto withdrew. Mehmed's death triggered a succession crisis. He had two surviving sons, Bayezid and Sem. Bayezid was governor of Amasya in Anatolia. Sem was governor of Karaman. Both rushed to Istanbul to claim the throne. Bayezid arrived first, with the support of the Janissaries. He was proclaimed sultan as Bayezid II. Sem refused to accept this. He raised an army and fought his brother, but Bayezid's forces were stronger. Sem was defeated and fled to Egypt, then to Rhodes, then to Europe. He spent years as a pawn in European politics, various rulers keeping him as a potential rival to Bayezid. Sem eventually died in Italy in 1495, possibly poisoned. Bayezid II ruled from 1481 to 1512. His reign was comparatively peaceful. He was nicknamed the Just or the Saint for his piety. He was more interested in consolidation than conquest. Bayezid did fight wars with Hungary, with Venice, with Mamluk Egypt, but these were largely defensive or limited conflicts. The empire did not expand dramatically under Bayezid. Bayezid was also interested in culture and learning. He patronized scholars and artists. He built mosques and schools. Istanbul grew and prospered as the imperial capital, but Bayezid's reign ended in crisis. His sons competed for the succession. The most aggressive was Selim, governor of Trebizond. Selim was impatient. He rebelled against his father, marching on Istanbul with an army. Bayezid's forces were reluctant to fight. Many sided with Selim. The Janissaries, in particular, favored the aggressive, warlike Selim over the peaceful, elderly Bayezid. In 1512, Bayezid abdicated in favor of Selim. He planned to retire to his birthplace, but he died on the journey. He was 55. Some sources suggest he was poisoned by Selim's agents, but this is unproven. Selim I became sultan in 1512. He would rule for only 8 years, but he would transform the empire. Selim was nicknamed Yavuz, the Grim or the Stern. He was brutal, even by the standards of his time. He executed his brothers and several nephews to prevent succession disputes. He executed so many officials and advisors that it became dangerous to serve near him. But Selim was also extraordinarily capable, and his ambitions lay not in Europe, but in the East. Selim's first major campaign was against the Safavid Empire of Persia. The Safavids were Shia Muslims, while the Ottomans were Sunni. This religious division was significant. Selim viewed the Safavids as heretics. In 1514, Selim led a huge army eastward. The two armies met at the Battle of Chaldiran. The Safavid Shah Ismail was defeated. The Ottomans conquered much of eastern Anatolia and northern Iraq, but the Safavid core territories, in what is now Iran, remained independent. Selim could not pursue further due to the distance and the exhaustion of his troops. Nevertheless, it was a significant victory. Selim then turned south, to the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks ruled Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz, the region of Arabia containing Mecca and Medina. They were a powerful state, though past their prime. In 1516, Selim invaded Syria. The Mamluks met him at the Battle of Marj Dabik, near Aleppo. The Mamluks were decisively defeated. The Mamluk Sultan was killed in battle. Selim conquered Syria rapidly. Damascus fell. Jerusalem fell. The holy cities were now under Ottoman control. In 1517, Selim invaded Egypt. The Mamluks fought again at the Battle of Radania near Cairo. Again, they were defeated. Cairo fell. The Mamluk state was destroyed. Egypt was fabulously wealthy. Its conquest doubled Ottoman revenues. The Ottomans now controlled the richest provinces of the Arab world. Selim also assumed guardianship of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. This gave the Ottoman sultans enormous prestige in the Islamic world. They became protectors of the pilgrimage routes. Later Ottoman sultans would use the title, Servant of the Two Holy Cities. Selim died in 1520, age 55. He had ruled only 8 years, but he had expanded the empire dramatically. He had made the Ottomans the dominant power in the Middle East. His son Suleiman would build on these achievements. Suleiman would take the empire to its greatest heights. He would be known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent. The Golden Age, Suleiman the Magnificent 1520-1566. When Suleiman became sultan in 1520, he was 25 years old. Intelligent, energetic, ambitious. He would rule for 46 years, the longest reign of any Ottoman sultan. In the West, he is known as Suleiman the Magnificent. In the Islamic world, he is called Suleiman the Lawgiver for his extensive legal reforms. Both names are appropriate. Suleiman's reign represents the apex of Ottoman power. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent. Its military was unmatched. Its treasury was full. Its arts and architecture flourished. Istanbul was one of the world's great cities. Suleiman began his reign with military campaigns. In 1521, he captured Belgrade. This strategically important fortress had resisted Ottoman sieges before. Now it fell. The road to Hungary lay open. In 1522, Suleiman besieged Rhodes. This island was held by the Knights Hospitaller, a crusading military order. The Knights had held Rhodes for over 200 years, using it as a base to raid Ottoman shipping. The siege lasted 6 months. The Knights fought heroically, but they were outnumbered. In December 1522, they negotiated a surrender. Suleiman allowed them to leave with honor. They relocated to Malta. With Rhodes conquered, Ottoman control of the eastern Mediterranean was secure. Suleiman's next target was Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary was a major Christian power, a barrier to Ottoman expansion in Europe. In 1526, Suleiman led a massive army into Hungary. The Hungarian king Louis II was young and inexperienced. He assembled an army to meet the Ottomans at Moses, in southern Hungary. The Battle of Mosees was a catastrophe for Hungary. The Hungarian army was destroyed. King Louis died, possibly drowning while fleeing. Hungary was left leaderless. Suleiman occupied Buda, the Hungarian capital, but he did not immediately annex Hungary. Instead, he installed a puppet king, János. Hungary became a contested territory, split between Ottoman influence and the Habsburg dynasty, which also claimed the throne. This conflict with the Habsburgs would define much of Suleiman's reign. The Habsburgs were the dominant dynasty in Europe. They ruled Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. Under Emperor Charles V, they seemed to encircle the Ottomans. Suleiman saw the Habsburgs as his main rival. The two empires clashed repeatedly. In 1529, Suleiman marched on Vienna, the Habsburg capital. This was the first siege of Vienna. Suleiman's army was enormous, perhaps over 100,000 men, but the campaign had problems. It was late in the year, the weather was poor, supplies were difficult to maintain over such long distances. The siege lasted only 3 weeks before Suleiman withdrew. Vienna had held. Christian Europe breathed a sigh of relief, but the threat remained. Suleiman campaigned in Europe several more times. In 1532, he marched toward Vienna again, but was delayed by the fortress of Gienz, which held out longer than expected. The campaigning season ended, and Suleiman withdrew. Suleiman also waged war against Persia. The Safavids remained a threat in the east. In 1534–35, Suleiman campaigned in Iraq, capturing Baghdad. The city would remain under Ottoman control, with interruptions, until World War I. But Suleiman's rivalry with the Safavids continued. There were further campaigns in the 1540s and 1552s. The wars were inconclusive. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow. Suleiman also expanded Ottoman naval power. He appointed capable admirals, most famously Harad Barbarossa. Barbarossa was a corsair, a pirate, but he became an Ottoman admiral and conducted successful naval campaigns in the Mediterranean. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman navy challenged Spanish and Venetian dominance. There were battles and raids. Ottoman power extended along the North African coast, with Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli becoming Ottoman provinces or vassals. But Suleiman was not just a conqueror. He was also a lawgiver, as his Islamic title suggests. Suleiman reformed and codified Ottoman law. He harmonized Islamic law Sharia with customary law canon. He reformed tax systems. He established clearer administrative procedures. These reforms brought order and efficiency. They earned him the title Kanuni, the lawgiver. Suleiman also patronized the arts. His court was magnificent. Poets, artists, calligraphers, musicians all flourished. The Ottoman court rivaled any in Europe for splendor. Architecture particularly thrived. The great architect Mimar Sinan built mosques, palaces, bridges, and aqueducts. The Sulaimani Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1557, is considered one of the masterpieces of Islamic architecture. It still stands today, a testament to the era's achievements. Suleiman's personal life was also remarkable. He fell in love with a slave girl named Roxolana, or Hrem Sultan in Ottoman sources. This was unusual. Ottoman sultans typically did not marry their concubines, but Suleiman married Roxolana. Roxolana was intelligent and influential. She advised Suleiman on political matters. She was involved in court intrigues. Some historians view her as a negative influence. Others see her as a capable partner. The truth is likely complex. Roxolana bore Suleiman several children. The succession became a source of tension. Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa, was popular and capable, but he was not Roxolana's son. Roxolana's sons were Selim and Bayezid. In 1553, Suleiman had Mustafa executed. The reasons are debated. Some sources say Mustafa was plotting against his father. Others say Suleiman was manipulated by Roxolana, who wanted her own sons to succeed. The truth is lost to intrigue and propaganda. Later, two of Roxolana's sons, Selim and Bayezid, fought each other. Suleiman sided with Selim. Bayezid fled to Persia but was eventually captured and executed. These family tragedies darkened Suleiman's later years. Roxelana died in 1558. Suleiman became more withdrawn, but he continued campaigning. In 1566, at age 71, Suleiman led one more campaign into Hungary. He besieged the fortress of Shigatar. During the siege, Suleiman died. Heart failure, most likely, given his age. He died in his tent on September 6, 1566. His death was kept secret from the army until the fortress fell. Then Selim, his surviving son, was proclaimed sultan. Suleiman's body was returned to Istanbul and buried with honors. Suleiman's reign had been extraordinary. He had expanded the empire, secured its borders, reformed its laws, patronized its culture. Under him, the Ottoman Empire had reached its zenith. But empires at their peak have nowhere to go but down. The long, slow decline would begin under Suleiman's successors. The long stagnation 1566-1683. Selim II became sultan in 1566. He was Suleiman's last surviving son. He was also, by most accounts, not particularly capable. Selim was nicknamed the drunkard or the sot. This may be unfair or exaggerated. Ottoman sources would not have recorded such details disrespectfully if they were entirely false, but propaganda and later invention cloud the picture. What is clear is that Selim was not the warrior and statesman his father had been. Selim's reign saw the empire continue, but momentum was lost. The great conquests were over. Capable grand viziers, particularly Sakalu Mem Pasha, managed the empire effectively, but the Sultan himself was less involved. In 1570, the Ottomans attacked Cyprus, then held by Venice. The campaign was successful. Cyprus fell in 1571 and became an Ottoman province. But in the same year, the Ottomans faced a major naval defeat. A coalition of Christian states, Spain, Venice, the papacy, and others assembled a fleet. The two fleets met at the Battle of Lepanto in the Gulf of Patras. The Ottoman fleet was destroyed. Perhaps 180 Ottoman ships were sunk or captured. Thousands of Ottoman sailors died. It was the first major Ottoman naval defeat in over a century. Christian Europe celebrated. The Turks, so long invincible, could be beaten. Bells rang in churches across Europe. But strategically, Lepanto was less significant than its symbolic impact. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a year. Cyprus remained Ottoman. The Christian coalition did not follow up their victory effectively. Still, Lepanto marked something. The age of easy Ottoman victories was over. Selim died in 1574, reportedly from a fall in a bathhouse while drunk. He was 50. His son Murad III succeeded him. Murad III ruled from 1574 to 1595. His reign saw long wars with Persia and with the Habsburgs. These wars were exhausting and largely inconclusive. The empire's resources were strained. Murad was more interested in the harem than in governance. He had numerous concubines and fathered over 100 children. This created succession problems. So many princes meant potential civil war. Murad's son Mehmed III solved this problem brutally. When he became sultan in 1595, he had 19 of his brothers executed, as well as several pregnant concubines to prevent more potential claimants. It was the largest royal fratricide in Ottoman history. Even by Ottoman standards, it was shocking. Mehmed III ruled until 1603. His reign saw continued war with Austria and Persia. The long Turkish War with Austria 1593-1606 was particularly draining. Neither side won decisively. The peace treaty essentially restored the pre-war borders. The 17th century brought more mediocre sultans. Ahmad I, Osman II, Murad IV, Ibrahim, Mehmed IV. Some were children when they took the throne. Some were mentally unstable. Some were capable, but their reigns were dominated by internal power struggles. The problem was structural. The sultan was supposed to be the absolute ruler, but when sultans were weak or young, power shifted to the harem, to the janissaries, to the grand viziers. The janissaries, in particular, became a problem. Originally elite troops, they had become an entrenched interest group. They resisted reforms. They demanded higher pay. They rioted when displeased. They made and unmade sultans. Several sultans tried to reform or disband the Janissaries, but were overthrown or killed for their efforts. Osman too was murdered by the Janissaries in 1622. Ibrahim was deposed and executed in 1648. The empire was still wealthy, still powerful, but it was no longer expanding. It was struggling to maintain what it had. There were occasional successes. The conquest of Crete from Venice, completed in 1669 after a 24-year war. The campaign was costly, but Crete was a significant prize. But in 1683, the Ottomans suffered a catastrophic defeat. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier, convinced Sultan Mehmed IV to authorize another campaign against Vienna. The Ottomans had not seriously threatened Vienna since 1529. Now, they would try again. A massive army, perhaps over 100,000 strong, marched on Vienna. The city was besieged starting in July 1683. Vienna's garrison was outnumbered, but well supplied and determined. They held for 2 months. Meanwhile, a relief army was assembled. The Holy Roman Emperor rallied support. The key figure was King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, who brought a powerful Polish army. On September 12, 1683, the relief army attacked the Ottoman siege lines. The Battle of Vienna was fierce. The Polish cavalry, the famous winged hussars, charged down from the hills. The Ottoman lines broke. The siege was lifted. The Ottomans retreated in disorder, abandoning their camp and supplies. It was a humiliating defeat. Kara Mustafa was executed by the Sultan for his failure, but the damage was done. The defeat at Vienna marked a turning point. The Ottomans were now on the defensive. Christian Europe went on the offensive. Decline and reform attempts 1683-1826. After the disaster at Vienna, the Ottomans faced coordinated attacks from multiple enemies. Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia formed alliances against the empire. The wars of the late 17th and early 18th centuries were disastrous for the Ottomans. Territory was lost. Hungary was lost. Transylvania was lost. Parts of Greece were lost. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 confirmed these losses. It was the first time the Ottomans had to cede territory in a peace treaty. The psychological impact was significant. The empire was no longer invincible. The 18th century brought continued pressures. Russia, under Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great, expanded southward at Ottoman expense. The Black Sea, once an Ottoman lake, became contested. Wars with Russia in November 1710, 1735-39, 1768-74, and 1787-92 generally went badly for the Ottomans. Territory was lost. The Crimean Khanate, an Ottoman vassal, was annexed by Russia. Austria also continued to threaten. Though the Ottomans won some battles and recovered some territory temporarily, the overall trend was negative. But the Ottomans were not passively accepting decline. There were attempts at reform. In 1718, the Ottoman Empire sent an embassy to France. This was significant. Ottoman sultans had traditionally viewed themselves as superior to European monarchs. They did not send ambassadors. They received them. But now, recognizing their backwardness in certain areas, they sought to learn from Europe. The embassy observed European military techniques, manufacturing, administration. The ambassador, Yermisikiz Mehmed Elebi, wrote a detailed report. This sparked interest in European methods. In the 1730s, Sultan Mahmud I supported the opening of a printing press in Istanbul. Printing in Turkish had been forbidden due to religious concerns and the power of the scribal class. Now, it was permitted for non-religious texts. This was a small but important step toward modernization. Military reforms were attempted repeatedly. European-style drills and tactics were introduced, with varying success. The problem was always the Janissaries. They resisted change. They saw European methods as threats to their privileges. One reforming sultan, Selim IIIr. 1789-1807, tried to create a new army. The Nizam setted new order, trained in European methods. This threatened the Janissaries. In 1807, they revolted. Selim was deposed and later murdered. His successor, Mustafa IV, was dominated by conservative forces, but Mustafa's reign was short. In 1808, Mahmud II, another reforming sultan, came to power. Mahmud II ruled from 1808 to 1839. He was determined to modernize the empire, even if it required brutal measures. Mahmud's biggest challenge was the Janissaries. He could not reform the military while they existed, so in 1826, he moved against them. Mahmud created a pretext. He announced reforms to the army. The Janissaries predictably rioted, but this time, Mahmud was prepared. He had loyal troops ready. Artillery was brought in. The Janissary barracks were bombarded. Thousands of Janissaries were killed. The rest were disbanded. This event, called the Auspicious Incident in Ottoman sources, was brutal, but it broke the power of the Janissaries. Mahmud could now proceed with reforms. Mahmud modernized the military along European lines. He reformed the administration. He introduced Western-style clothing for officials, replacing turbans and robes with frock coats and fezzes. He opened new schools teaching European sciences. These reforms were controversial. Traditionalists saw them as betraying Islamic values, but Mahmud pressed forward. However, Mahmud also faced serious external challenges. In Greece, a nationalist rebellion began in 1821. The Greeks sought independence from Ottoman rule. The rebellion was bloody. Both sides committed atrocities. European opinion sympathized with the Greeks. The Romantic movement idealized ancient Greece. Volunteers, including the poet Lord Byron, went to fight for Greek independence. In 1827, Britain, France, and Russia intervened militarily. Their fleets destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian fleet at the Battle of Navarino. This was the decisive blow. In 1830, Greece was granted independence. The Ottomans had lost territory in Europe, not to a great power, but to a nationalist rebellion. This set a dangerous precedent. Other nationalist movements emerged. Serbia gained autonomy. Egypt, under Mehmed Ali Pasha, became effectively independent, though nominally still Ottoman. Mehmed Ali even invaded Syria in the 1830s, threatening Istanbul itself. The Ottomans had to ask European powers for help to stop their own vassal. The empire was fragmenting. Mahmud's reforms were necessary, but they came too late and were insufficient. Mahmud died in 1839, disappointed but still working on reforms. His son Abdülmecid I continued the reform efforts, beginning a period called the Tanzimat, the reorganization. The sick man of Europe 1839-1908, the Tanzimat period, from 1839 to 1876, was an era of intensive reform efforts. The goal was to modernize the empire, to make it competitive with European powers, and to prevent its disintegration. The Tanzimat reforms were comprehensive. Legal reforms, administrative reforms, educational reforms, economic reforms. The Lane Decree of 1839 proclaimed equality for all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion. Christians and Jews would have the same rights as Muslims. This was revolutionary. Traditional Islamic law differentiated between Muslims and non-Muslims. New secular courts were established alongside religious courts. New legal codes were written, based partly on French law. The army was further modernized. Schools teaching European-style curricula were opened. Infrastructure was developed. Railroads were built. Telegraph lines were strung. Ports were improved. These reforms were real and substantial, but they also created tensions. Traditionalists opposed them. They saw the reforms as abandoning Islamic principles in favor of Western Christian values. There was resistance, sometimes violent. The reforms also created financial problems. Modernization was expensive. Railroads, schools, new military equipment. The empire went into debt, borrowing heavily from European banks. The debt would eventually become unsustainable, giving European powers leverage over Ottoman policy. There were also external crises. The Crimean War 1853-56 pitted the Ottomans and their allies Britain and France against Russia. The war was fought over influence in Ottoman territories. The Ottomans won, with European help, but the victory was costly. In the Balkans, nationalist movements intensified. Romanians, Bulgarians, Serbs, all sought independence or autonomy. The empire struggled to suppress these movements. In 1876, Bulgaria revolted. The Ottomans suppressed the rebellion brutally. Reports of massacres shocked European opinion. The Bulgarian horrors became a cause célèbre. Russia used this as a pretext for war. In 1877, Russia invaded Ottoman territory in the Balkans and the Caucasus. The Ottomans fought but were defeated. The Treaty of San Stefano in 1878 imposed harsh terms. Much of the Balkans was to be lost. However, European powers, particularly Britain and Austria, objected. They did not want Russia to become too powerful. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, the terms were revised. The Ottomans still lost territory. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro became fully independent. Bulgaria gained autonomy. Austria-Hungary occupied Bosnia-Herzegovina. Russia gained territory in the Caucasus, but the empire survived. Barely. In Istanbul, the political situation was turbulent. In 1876, Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed in a coup. His nephew Muradvi became sultan, but suffered a mental breakdown and was deposed after 3 months. Murad's brother Abdulhamid II became sultan. Abdulhamid II would rule from 1876 to 1909, one of the longest reigns in Ottoman history. He was intelligent, paranoid, and autocratic. Initially, reformers hoped Abdulhamid would support liberalization. In 1876, the empire's first constitution was promulgated. A parliament was elected. This seemed like progress toward constitutional monarchy, but the constitution gave the sultan extensive powers, and in 1878, Abdulhamid suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament. He ruled as an autocrat for the next 30 years. Abdulhamid was not opposed to modernization. He continued building railroads, schools, and telegraphs. He modernized the army and administration, but he opposed political liberalization. He suppressed dissent. He used censorship and secret police extensively. Under Abdulhamid, the empire avoided major territorial losses for a while, but pressures continued. Armenian nationalism emerged as an issue. Armenians, a Christian minority concentrated in eastern Anatolia, sought reforms and autonomy. Some formed revolutionary organizations. The Ottoman response was harsh. In the 1890s, there were massacres of Armenians. Estimates vary, but tens of thousands died. The massacres drew international condemnation, but did not lead to effective intervention. European imperialism also pressured the empire. Britain occupied Egypt in 1882, though Egypt nominally remained Ottoman. France expanded its influence in North Africa, eventually taking Tunisia as a protectorate. The empire was called the sick man of Europe. European powers debated the Eastern question: what would happen when the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed? How would its territories be divided? But the empire did not collapse. It persisted, weak but functioning. Opposition to Abdulhamid's autocracy grew, especially among military officers and intellectuals. They formed secret societies calling for constitutional government. The most important was the Committee of Union and Progress, also known as the Young Turks. In 1908, a mutiny by military units in Macedonia forced Abdulhamid's hand. He restored the constitution and recalled parliament. This was the Young Turk Revolution. It was celebrated initially as the beginning of a new era. Liberty, equality, fraternity were the slogans. The Ottoman Empire would become a constitutional monarchy, but the euphoria was short-lived. The final years, 1908–1922, the restoration of constitutional government in 1908, did not bring stability. Instead, it opened a Pandora's box. Different groups had different visions for the empire's future. The Young Turks wanted centralization and modernization. Minority groups wanted autonomy or independence. Conservatives wanted to preserve traditional structures. Islamists wanted the empire to remain explicitly Islamic. These competing visions led to conflict. In 1909, a counter-revolution attempted to restore Abdulhamid's absolute power. The uprising was suppressed by Young Turk forces. Abdulhamid was deposed and replaced by his brother Mehmed, a figurehead. Real power lay with the Young Turk leadership. The Young Turks, particularly the triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, increasingly dominated the government. They were nationalist and modernizing, but also authoritarian. Externally, the empire faced crisis after crisis. In 1911, Italy invaded Libya, an Ottoman province in North Africa. The Ottomans could not effectively defend territory so far from the center. Libya was lost. In 1912, the Balkan states Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro allied and attacked the Ottoman Empire. The First Balkan War was a disaster for the Ottomans. They lost nearly all their remaining European territory. Only a small strip around Istanbul remained. In 1913, the Second Balkan War saw the Balkan states fight among themselves. The Ottomans recovered some territory, including Edirne, but the damage was done. The empire's European provinces were gone. These defeats were humiliating. The Young Turks, determined to strengthen the empire, pursued increasingly nationalist policies. Ottoman identity was being redefined as Turkish identity. This alienated non-Turkish groups. And then came World War I. The war began in 1914. The Ottoman Empire, under Young Turk leadership, allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. This was a controversial decision. The empire had no quarrel with Britain or France, but the leadership believed alliance with Germany offered the best chance to recover lost territories and restore Ottoman power. The war was catastrophic for the Ottomans. There were multiple fronts. In the Caucasus, the Ottomans fought Russia. In Mesopotamia and Palestine, they fought British forces. In the Dardanelles, they faced a British and French invasion at Gallipoli. The Gallipoli campaign 1915-16 was one of the few Ottoman successes. The Allied invasion was repelled with heavy losses on both sides. A young Ottoman officer named Mustafa Kemal distinguished himself in the defense. But on other fronts, the Ottomans struggled. The war strained the empire's resources. Food shortages, inflation, conscription drained manpower. And then there was the Armenian genocide. In 1915, the Young Turk government ordered the deportation of Armenians from eastern Anatolia. The official reason was security. Armenians were accused of collaborating with Russia. The deportations were death marches. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians died from starvation, exposure, and massacres. The exact number is debated, but estimates range from 600,000 to over 1 million. This was genocide. The Ottoman government systematically destroyed the Armenian population of Anatolia. The event is deeply contested. The Turkish government today denies it was genocide, calling it a tragedy of war, but the historical consensus among scholars is that it was genocide. The war continued. By 1917, the Ottomans were exhausted. Russia, one of their main enemies, collapsed into revolution and exited the war. This provided some relief. But in 1918, British forces under General Allenby conquered Palestine and Syria. Arab forces, led by Sharif Hussein and advised by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, revolted against Ottoman rule. The Arabs had been promised independence by the British. In October 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed an armistice. The war was over. The empire had lost. The armistice terms were harsh. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. The Ottoman army was demobilized. The empire's non-Turkish territories were divided among the allies. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 formalized this. The treaty left the Ottomans with only a small portion of Anatolia. Much of Anatolia was to be divided among Greece, Armenia, France, and Italy. The Turkish heartland itself was to be partitioned. The Ottoman government, weak and controlled by the Allies, accepted the treaty, but many Turks did not. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, organized resistance. He established a nationalist government in Ankara in central Anatolia. He rallied Turkish forces and declared that the Brest Treaty was illegitimate. A Turkish War of Independence followed. From 1919 to 1922, Turkish forces fought Greek forces in western Anatolia. They fought French forces in the south. They fought Armenian forces in the east. The war was brutal. Atrocities were committed on all sides. But the Turkish nationalists, under Mustafa Kemal's leadership, won. In 1922, Greek forces were expelled from Anatolia. The Allies agreed to renegotiate the treaty. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne established the borders of modern Turkey, largely on Turkish terms. The Ottoman Empire was finished. On November 1, 1922, the Turkish nationalist government formally abolished the Sultanate. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, fled Istanbul on a British warship. In 1924, the Caliphate itself was abolished. The Ottoman dynasty was exiled from Turkey. The empire that had lasted over 600 years was gone. In its place rose the Republic of Turkey, led by Mustafa Kemal, who would take the name Atatürk, father of the Turks. The Ottoman Empire had ended, not with a dramatic fall, but with a negotiated dissolution and transformation. The Ottomans had been replaced by nation-states. The old order had given way to the new. Legacy and reflection: the Ottoman Empire is gone, but its legacy remains, deeply embedded in the modern world. Geographically, the empire's legacy is visible in the map. The borders of modern Turkey, the divisions of the Middle East, the ethnic complexities of the Balkans, all these bear the Ottoman imprint. The Ottoman system of millets, semi-autonomous religious communities, shaped the demographic patterns of the region. Greeks concentrated in certain areas, Armenians in others, Jews in cities. These patterns, disrupted by war and genocide, still influence the region. The forced population exchanges of the 1920s Greeks and Turks exchanged between Greece and Turkey were attempts to create ethnically homogeneous nation-states. But they were also acknowledgments that the Ottoman system of multi-ethnic empire was no longer viable in the age of nationalism. Culturally, the Ottoman Empire left a rich legacy. Ottoman architecture is one of the most visible. The great mosques of Istanbul, the Sulaymani, the Sultan Ahmed Blue Mosque, are still among the world's architectural marvels. Ottoman palace complexes, like Topkapı Palace, are museums today, filled with treasures and historical artifacts. They attract millions of visitors annually. Ottoman cuisine influenced the cuisines of the Balkans and Middle East. Many dishes claimed by modern nations, baklava, kebabs, coffee preparations, have Ottoman roots. The Turkish language itself carries the Ottoman legacy. Modern Turkish underwent a deliberate language reform in the 1920s, replacing many Arabic and Persian loanwords with Turkish neologisms or borrowings from Western languages. But the language's structure and much of its vocabulary still reflect Ottoman Turkish. Politically, the Ottoman legacy is more contested. For Turks, the empire is a source of pride and ambivalence. Pride in its achievements, its power, its cultural sophistications, ambivalence about its eventual decline, and the trauma of its end. Turkish nationalism, as embodied by Atatürk, rejected much of the Ottoman heritage. The Ottoman sultans were seen as decadent and backward. The republic would be secular, modernizing, Western-oriented. Ottoman history was taught, but critically. In recent decades, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, there has been a partial rehabilitation of the Ottoman legacy. Erdogan's government has emphasized Turkey's Ottoman heritage, sometimes using it to justify assertive foreign policies. The empire is portrayed more positively than in Atatürk's era. This neo-Ottomanism is controversial within Turkey and alarming to some neighbors who see it as Turkish expansionism. For the Arab world, the Ottoman legacy is complex. The Ottomans ruled Arab lands for 400 years. Some Arabs see this as a period of backwardness and stagnation. Arab nationalism, which emerged in the late Ottoman period, defined itself partly in opposition to Turkish rule. But others view the Ottoman period more favorably, as a time when the Arab world was part of a powerful, successful Islamic empire. With the chaos and division of the modern Middle East, some romanticize the Ottoman era. For Greeks and other Balkan peoples, the Ottoman period is remembered as foreign occupation. The 400 years of Ottoman rule are called the Turkocratia, Turkish rule. It is remembered as a dark age, though historical scholarship has complicated this narrative. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and others fought long struggles for independence from Ottoman rule. Their national identities were forged in opposition to the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire is the villain in their national narratives, but even here, the reality was more nuanced. Many Greeks, Armenians, and others served in the Ottoman administration. They prospered under Ottoman rule. The relationship was not simply oppressor and oppressed. For Armenians, the Ottoman legacy is dominated by the genocide. The destruction of the Ottoman Armenian community in 1915 is the central trauma of modern Armenian history. The Turkish government's refusal to acknowledge this as genocide remains a major source of tension. For Jews, the Ottoman Empire is often remembered more favorably. When Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, the Ottoman Empire welcomed them. Istanbul, Thessaloniki, and other Ottoman cities became major centers of Jewish life. The Ottomans were generally more tolerant of Jews than contemporary Christian Europe was. This history complicates the modern Israeli-Turkish relationship. Turkey was one of the first Muslim-majority countries to recognize Israel, but the relationship has become strained in recent decades. Historically, the Ottoman Empire offers lessons. One lesson is about diversity. The Ottomans managed to hold together a remarkably diverse empire for centuries. They did this through a combination of tolerance, pragmatism, and, when necessary, force. The millet system allowed religious communities significant autonomy. This was not perfect. There was discrimination and occasional violence, but it worked for a long time. When the empire tried to centralize and impose a uniform identity in the 19th century, it accelerated its breakup. Nationalism, the idea that each ethnic group should have its own nation-state, was incompatible with the multi-ethnic empire. This raises questions relevant today. In our globalized world, we face issues of diversity, identity, and coexistence. Can lessons from the Ottoman experience inform modern debates? Or was the Ottoman system too rooted in its time and place to offer relevant lessons? Another lesson concerns reform and modernization. The Ottomans tried repeatedly to reform and modernize, especially in the 19th century. These efforts were sincere and sometimes successful, but they came too late and faced tremendous resistance from entrenched interests. This pattern, trying to reform a system while maintaining its essential character, is a challenge many societies face. How do you modernize without losing your identity? How do you adopt foreign practices without becoming a copy of the foreign? The Ottomans never solved this dilemma. The empire fell, but the attempt is instructive. A third lesson is about the rise and fall of empires. The Ottoman Empire lasted 600 years, longer than most, but it still fell. All empires do, eventually. The empire rose because of favorable circumstances, a power vacuum in Anatolia and the Balkans, capable leaders, military effectiveness. It endured because of adaptability and administrative competence. It fell because of changing geopolitical circumstances, the rise of European power, the emergence of nationalism, military obsolescence, internal decay. Studying the Ottoman Empire reminds us that no political order is permanent. Even the most powerful empires are shaped by forces beyond their control. History is a story of rise and fall, over and over. The Ottoman Empire is history now, but it is history that still lives in the present, in the borders of nations, in the architecture of cities, in the memories of peoples, in the ongoing debates about identity, religion, and governance. Understanding the Ottoman Empire helps us understand the modern Middle East and Balkans. It provides context for contemporary conflicts and complexities. It reminds us that the present is built on the past, always. We have traveled through 600 years, from the hills of Anatolia to the halls of Topkapı Palace, from the conquests of Mehmed the Conqueror to the collapse after World War I. It is a long story, a complex story. No single narrative can capture all of it. What we have traced is one path through the history, focusing on the major events and patterns. But history is made of countless individual stories. The soldier who fought at Kosovo, the merchant who traded in Istanbul's bazaars, the peasant who tilled fields in Anatolia, the slave who rose to become a grand vizier, the woman who raised children in the harem, the architect who designed mosques, the sailor who navigated the Mediterranean. Each of them lived a life as full and complex as ours. Each had hopes and fears. Each made choices. Each is now dust, but once they were as real as we are. The Ottoman Empire, for all its grandeur and its flaws, was made of these people. Millions upon millions of individual lives, stacked across centuries. We cannot know them all. We can only know the broad outlines. The sultans, the wars, the treaties, the major turning points. But in understanding these, we come closer to understanding the human experience. The patterns repeat: ambition, conflict, cooperation, decline, renewal. These are human constants. The Ottomans were not so different from us. They faced similar questions. How do we organize our society? How do we deal with diversity? How do we balance tradition and change? How do we respond to threats? How do we find meaning? Their answers were shaped by their time and place, but the questions themselves are eternal. As you rest now, you carry this history with you. 600 years of human effort and struggle, of achievement and failure, of the rise and fall of a great empire. History can teach us humility. We are part of a long chain. Those who came before us built the world we inherit. Those who come after will judge what we build. History can also teach us perspective. The problems that seem overwhelming today, wars, divisions, challenges, are not new. Humans have faced them before. Some were solved, some were endured, some led to collapse. We are not guaranteed success, but we are part of the ongoing story. History did not end with the Ottomans. It continues with us. As you drift towards sleep, let the weight of these centuries settle gently upon you. Not as a burden, but as a connection. You are part of something larger than yourself. Part of the human story that stretches from the distant past into the uncertain future. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but what it represented, the human capacity to build, to create, to organize, to adapt, and yes, to fail and fall, that remains. May you rest well, may your dreams be gentle, and may you wake with a deeper sense of your place in the long, winding river of history. Sleep now. The story has been told. The empire has risen and fallen. The lessons have been laid out. It is time to rest. Good night. May history's long perspective bring you peace.